Hello everyone, my name is Sammy Segovia and I am a tutor of the Learning Center. Today we're going to learn an easier way to remember the unit circle using radians in preparation for Calc 1. So let's begin. So when solving for sine or cosine of any value in the unit circle, there are a set of possible values to choose from. And these possible values include 0, positive or negative 1, positive or negative 1/2, positive or negative rad 2 over 2, and finally positive or negative rad 3 over 2. Now that we know the possible values we can get, next we're going to learn the sine and cosine of the four main points of the unit circle. So here is our coordinate system that represents the unit circle. Remember that in interval notation, the x value is represented by cosine, while the y value is represented by sine. For the unit circle, there are four main points on the left, right, top, and bottom. For the right point, it would be 0 or 2 pi. For the top point, it would be pi over 2. The left would be pi. And the bottom would be 3 pi over 2. So following the interval notation in the top right corner, for 0 and 2 pi, the cosine is 1 while the sine is 0. For pi over 2, the cosine is 0 while the sine is 1. For pi, the cosine is negative 1 while the sine is 0. And for 3 pi over 2, the cosine is 0 while the sine is negative 1. Now that we know the sine and the cosine for each of the four main points, next we're going to cover the four quadrants and when each are positive and negative. So again, following the interval notation in the top right corner, here's quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. So once again, following the interval notation in the top right corner, for quadrant 1, both the cosine and sine are positive. For quadrant 2, the cosine is negative while the sine is positive. For quadrant 3, both the cosine and sine are negative. And for quadrant 4, the cosine is positive while the sine is negative. Now that we know the sine and cosine values for the points 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, we're going to learn the sine and cosine values for the points inside each quadrant, which include anything of pi over 6, pi over 4, and pi over 3. So when you take the sine and cosine of anything pi to the fourth, the result will always be rad 2 over 2 regardless. And it would be positive or negative depending on the quadrant as well as if it's sine or cosine. This also applies when you do sine or cosine of any other value. So the result of sine of anything pi to the 6 would be 1/2. And the cosine of anything of pi to the 6 would be rad 3 over 2. The same results will apply for sine or cosine of pi over 3 except reverse. So the result of sine of anything pi over 3 would be rad 3 over 2. And the cosine of anything pi over 3 would be 1/2. In case you get confused of either putting 1/2 or rad 3 over 2 when taking the sine or cosine of either pi over 6 or pi over 3, there is a visual method I use to remember this. So when I imagine anything pi over 6, I imagine a long slanted triangle. And when I imagine anything pi over 3, I imagine a tall skinny triangle. So the longer side, which is represented by x, would be rad 3 over 2, which when you calculate it would be a larger number than 1/2. And the smaller side, represented by y, would be 1/2. And for pi over 3, the smaller side represented by x would be 1/2, while the larger side represented by y would be rad 3 over 2. So here's a method I use in order to visually memorize this. Now we learned all the possible values we can get from taking the sine or cosine of any value of the unit circle. Today we've learned an easier way to remember the unit circle in radians without having to memorize the entire unit circle graph. Thank you.